How you doing?
Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. So, okay, so now we are live. So make sure we're off Facebook so that we won't start that vibration. Hi, welcome to Poets and Poetry Matters. This is a program presented by North Carolina Poetry Society. I am Celestine Davis, the current president. And I'm so happy to bring this series to you because I get to talk to such wonderful poets. We had a wonderful time with Glennis Redmond last month. And this month we have another one of my favorites, which is Mr. Keith Flynn, which I've known for quite a while. He's one of the very first persons that actually dared me to become a poet. And so this is probably where I'm in the state I'm in right now. So I don't know where to thank him or just, whatever. Yeah. But I do welcome him very much.
You're welcome, Celestine. You're welcome.
I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that. And so North Carolina Poetry Society is celebrating our 90th year of being in existence. It's wonderful. We have some great programming that's put on by VP of Programming, Linda Rush Myers. And so make sure you just come in and to this page and find out what we're doing. Go to the ncpoetry.org to keep up with all the contests and programs we have. Make sure you join us. Our VP of Senior VP of Membership is joined us, which is Ms. Joan here. And I'm so glad to see you here. And also, we have a wonderful group of volunteer board members and volunteers across the board to make this such a wonderful organization. So you want to be a part of us. So come and find out some volunteer opportunities as well. So again, I want to introduce you to Mr. Keith Flynn. I want to talk to you a little bit about what he's been up to. He is a widely traveled poet and performer. He has used different voices to accomplish his aims. Serving as a lyricist and lead singer from 1986 to 1998, Flynn's poems were blasted to full effect by double-barrel sonic accompaniment of the Crystal Zoo, which produced 3 albums, Swimming Through Lake Erie, 1992, Pooch, 1996, and Nervous Splendor, 2003, an innovative compilation of music and spoken word. Flynn is currently on hiatus with his most recent group, 3-man combo, the Holy Men, whose first album, Live at Diana Wortham Theater, was released in 2011. And so we're going to talk about his White Rock Hall in just a moment, which is where he is right now. So I can't wait to find out more about that. He's the author of 7 books, 6 collections of poetry: The Talking Drum, 1991, The Book of Monsters, 1994, The Lost Sea, 2000, The Golden Ratio, 2007, Colony Collapse Disorder, which I think that's the first one I bought from you, of yours, and The Skin of Meaning, which I have that too, and his first collection of essays, The Rhythm Method, Razzmatazz, which I have here, and Memory, right? This is one of my go-to books all the time. Okay, so what I want to talk about is, he has this new collection called Skin of Meaning, which hopefully we'll get to hear something about. And we're just going to talk to him about about different ways of his process and different ways he's moved through his life as a poet. And I think that's something that a lot of times we don't think about. We do it, but we don't think about it. We don't really share it. So I want to read to you the back of his book. And I'm going to try to slow down because I have a tendency to talk really fast, so I will slow down. In the back of The Skin of Meaning, it says, "For some time, we've been waiting for a poet to appear who could adequately confront the vast and deliriously complex matter of the USA, its people, its art, its material and popular culture, its misdeeds, and its election mistakes. Also, one who could respond to the artistic legacy of Europe. Keith Flynn is that poet. His range is wider than any poets I'm aware of, a range matched by his varied diction and his fluent mastery of syntax. The apparent ease he brings to this thorny project is one of the work's most impressive aspects. I urge readers to greet this book with the praise it deserves." And this was written by Alfred Korn, author of Unions. And this is the second one. Keith Flynn is a brilliant, bodacious poet at the top of his sonnet linguistic game in this new volume of poetry, The Skin of Meaning, with the poems that dance off the page and arpeggios of flight, gripping the reader's imagination and taking American poetry in a new, exhilarating direction. And that was written by Quincy Troop, author of the recent books, Ghost Voices, Seduction, and the memoir Miles and Me. Wow, those were some awesome reviews. And I think deservedly. So what do you say about why you think people get so excited about your work? What are you trying to do?
Well, I think I don't know about so excited. You know, poets as a general rule are neglected by our very nature. So you know, you can become quite famous as a poet in this country, relatively speaking, and nobody, you know, you're nobody's household name. Let's put it that way. So it doesn't, you know, those things really, they don't matter. They have no effect really on me, other than the fact that you might be able to ask a little bit more money for fees when you show up to read your poetry or you teach your workshops. So that's about it. I think the most important thing is to be in touch with your own process, to constantly be sharpening your own axe, and to get it. I think Kafka said, art is the axe with which I break open the frozen sea within myself. I spend most of my time chopping at that frozen ice.
So tell me, how do you just wake up one morning and say, I'm a poet? How did that happen?
Well, I actually went to Mars Hill College on a basketball scholarship, and I hadn't actually started writing poems. I'd written some poems when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I was watching some horrific footage from the Vietnamese War, and I guess I was 8, 9, 10, probably in that age. And I just disappeared one day. I went to the top of this mountain. I climbed in my tree house and I wrote poems all afternoon. And I brought them home. And my mother had exactly the right response. I showed them to her, and she made, you know, a great deal over them. She laid them out. She put them in wax paper, and she put them in her hope chest. And she made me feel as if my voice was important, that what I had to say mattered. And that was a really, you know, that was a moment that could have gone a lot of different ways. You know, they could have. I'd always been. My mother's a librarian, by the way, so that could have clearly prejudiced her viewpoint. But it was the right response. And then when I was in college, I played basketball for a couple of years. I discovered that I was getting tired of it. It was difficult to do what I wanted to do, and I discovered also I went to a creative writing class. And I read the poetry of William Blake. And there was a teacher there, Dr. Pat Verhulst, who just died. Hi. Who just died this past year. And Dr. Verhulst, she gave me the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was really sort of this amazing book by Blake. Blake has been the instigator of a lot of people's poor career choices, and he's been an inspiration to lots of folks. And I'll never forget those first aphorisms that I read of his. They were just you know, the Proverbs of hell. In seed time learn, and harvest teach, in winter enjoy. Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. The cut worm forgives the plow. Soon murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. Exuberance is beauty. Energy is eternal delight. Each of these aphorisms just sort of went into me like these arrows straight into the redemptive force of my imagination. And I could not shake it loose. I started writing poetry. Something broke this spring open in me. And it was Blake. There's no question about it. And soon I was writing poetry every day. That's a practice that I've continued for the past 40 years. It was, I began to think that there was nothing more honorable in this world than I thought if I walked down the street and somebody pointed at me and said, he's a poet, that would just be, you know, that would be to catch me out. That would be something that to aspire to. And so I started majoring in creative writing. I transferred to UNCA. I was their first scholarship student in their creative writing program when they started it in 1983. And I was going to go to law school from there, and actually went to Nashville thinking I was going to go to law school in Vanderbilt, but instead I had started writing some songs, and Warren Haynes was a friend of mine, and he produced some of our first demos, and pretty soon we had a manager and a band and a booking agent, and I spent the next 18 years singing in a rock and roll band. Never made it to law school. My father on his deathbed even mentioned something about, you would have made a really good lawyer, son.
Wow, wow, that's just awesome, because to have that, to know that early on, that's got to be a boon to anyone's career, to know that's what you want to do. So that really answers a lot of questions to me, is how, just prolific you have been, not just in the amount of work, but the kind of work, because you don't, your portraits is so rich, you didn't just sit there and just, fly off something that, like I often do sometimes just to get myself warmed up, but there's a lot of thought process I can tell in each and every one of your poems, and it really comes across that you revere it. You're not just doing it, you're doing it, but you also revere it, you respect the work. So I applaud you for that. And I'm just tickled pink that you had that kind of start, because everyone doesn't. Everybody, a lot of people had to fight to become a poet, because there's no one that supports them, or they don't have the confidence that they can do it, even though they're doing it.
Well, one of the most important things that happens in every poet's chronology, and I'm everybody I'm speaking to right now, wherever you are, each of you who are writing poetry, there was a teacher somewhere, that place down the line, that told you could do it and made you believe it. And that happens every time. Dr. Verhulst was that for me in college. Livia Bertinoli, who was a poet, wrote textbooks, and UNCA was another person, and David Hopes was my mentor there. But when I was in the 5th grade, when I was younger in the 3rd and 4th, 5th grade, I typically, all I thought about was basketball, and I typically was bored in class. And I had this teacher in the 5th grade who, after I'd probably thrown another spitball or pulled another braid or got myself in some kind of trouble, she walked over to me and grabbed me by the ear and pulled me out in the hallway. And she took this key that she had around her neck and she handed it to me. And it was the key to the library. And she said, anytime you start wanting to act up, anytime you start wanting to show your little butt, she goes, don't make a fuss, walk down to the library and you read anything you want to read. You write me one paragraph and I'll give you extra credit. And that really lit me up. That made me think, I was really ambitious. I wanted to read everything in there. The first book that I pulled off the shelf was solid red with no cover. It was a solid red hardcover, and it was a biography of the Apache chief Cochise. And that seems entirely appropriate in retrospect.
So you really got encouraged and got, so it's really glad that, I'm glad that you had these people at pivotal times in your life that encourage you to, to be as literate as you are, because I think that's one of the ways I would describe you, a very literate poet, because you do other readings, you're involved in other kinds of studies that inform your poetry and what you write about and how you write about it. And we're going to talk about it too, moving forward to some of what your new projects are. And I think that's really apropos in discussing that. And, like you're saying, how you came about becoming a poet, but how do you come about it meaning more than just the expression of words on a page? You took it out to a community building. How do you come about saying, well, this is what I want to do as a poet? Or was it just what you wanted to do and just brought your gifts as a poet to it? Exactly how did that come about for you?
Well, I was on the road, like I said, for about 18 years in a rock and roll band. And when I came off the road, I'd published my first book. I was about to publish my second when I moved back to Asheville for a little while and started the Asheville Poetry Review. I've been editing it for 28 years. So that was for me in lieu of teaching at a university somewhere, because I'm not very big on committees. And I love to teach. I mean, I teach a lot of workshops, but I prefer a less structured environment where I can come in and pour gas over them and light them on fire, and then I get to leave. And I prefer that method when I can do it. But poetry, it really, I was sort of at the mercy of words and the way, all the endless variations of sounds. I mean, poetry is what the world wants when its heart is broken. I mean, poetry is what we use to bury our loved ones. We say poetry to one another when we get married. We use poetry to pledge allegiance to the state. So poetry, the first things that happen to us when we're children is we love the sound of words in our mouth. And I believe that children acquire language to tell the stories that are already within them. There's a tribal DNA, and that tribal DNA is made manifest by the way we use the language that we acquire. And so we are what we read, right? We are made up of the books that we've encountered along the way. And there's a long river of literature that has occurred before now, and we have to try to find our place in that river. Where does our voice belong? What is it that we can say that's unlike anything that's been happened before us or that may happen after us? It's hard to know really and truly, if anything that we read or write is going to survive us. But, that's not the important thing. The important thing is to find the limits of our own ability, to find the limits of the language as it occurs in our own imagination. That's what's most important.
So, tell me, how do you come about? I know you support like particular charities and particular kinds of advocacy. So how do you choose those things, and and tell us how that came into being with, I really want to know how you connected some of the things you're doing right now. Like right now you're in a White Rock Sanctuary where you do a lot of performances and those sort of things. So tell me exactly what was your vision for White Rock?
Well, originally, my wife found this 100-year-old church that they were getting ready to tear down. And she and my mother called me, and I was on the road and was telling me that we needed to save this church. The church I grew up singing in when I was a little boy, I was 5 and 6 years old when I started singing in the choir. And they were tearing that church down. So there was this whole host of these churches that were, built around the start of the 20th century that were starting to go away. And so we decided to buy the church. We bought a 16-acre campus nearby, and we picked the church up, moved it to the top of the mountain. We jacked it up 18 feet. We built the first floor under it. Then we dropped the church down on top of that first floor. And we live in the first floor. And on the second floor, we have a sanctuary that we have a recording studio and a sound stage. All the classrooms have been turned into a kitchen. And then on the third floor, there's a full apartment underneath the bell tower. And so for me, this was a way, we do a video and a radio component. The church was called White Rock Presbyterian Church. I'm sitting here now, and this wall behind me is covered in mirrors. We have 8-foot windows on both sides of the church, and then this one whole wall. And so we covered it in mirrors. Number one, mirrors are a portal for energy, and they also reflect light. So we painted all the walls gold. So when it lights up in this room, we set the church so that the sun comes up on one side and it lights that side, and it goes down on the other side. So we get the full morning and evening sun in that way. And so live at White Rock Hall is the video component. We bring in nationally or internationally known authors. We pair them with the regional musicians, and then we film the collaborations live. And then the radio component is a radio show I do. It's also called Live at White Rock Hall. And you can see radio sessions at the website, live@whiterockhall.com. Again, live@whiterockhall.com. There's also a history and a film of the church being moved. And the radio show is poetry, every genre of music you can think of, and they're in dialogue with one another, the lyrics underneath a banner, which is a theme. Each show has a theme, it lasts 56 minutes. And I do it like I do my own poetry. I pack it with as much information as I can.
Mhm.
I want it to be muscular, like sentences are supposed to be. And I invite everybody to see that, and I invite everybody to go to that show. This is just another way to try to disseminate all the incredible poetry and the incredible writers that I come in contact with, and to try to share that as much as I can. I want folks to walk away from this with either of those sessions, either the video or the radio components, hoping they've heard something or discovered something they've never heard before.
So they can find all this about at keithflynn.net.
Well, that's my website for my own work, but I would encourage them to go there. Yes, it'll show you the history of my work, but the history of the church and all of the performances. I mean, we have Minton Sparks and William Pitt Root and Quincy Troop, interviews with these folks, as well as performances with them and ways to buy their work. And along with the, like I said, if you go to the dashboard, you can also see radio sessions, and that'll take you to the first 6 radio shows. We've done 24 shows now with the radio stuff, and we've just been picked up by Pacifica Network.
Well, that's great. We'll post all this in on the NC on the Facebook page. So we'll post all those connections to you, because I know people are going to ask me about it. So I'll make sure they have a way to get to that information, because I'm interested myself. So I'm sure that they are as well. So in thinking about, we kind of talked about it, but we didn't talk about it directly, about your whole thing about connection between music and poetry. As you just kind of said, you kind of went into the poetry first, I assume, but you mentioned also you was singing in the church. So how did one inform the other? Because I know you're very big on, the musicality of poetry and rhythm, and, because you read a whole book about it. So I know that's an important part of how you approach your work. So
well, poetry is language with a shape, but it's also language with a sound. And it's very important to me, the power of, and they're really kissing cousins. To me, the way that a poem assimilates its drive and its will and its momentum is through its sound. And it gets into the reader's imagination and subconscious in ways that hide the seams. I mean, William Matthews said that the power of music that poetry lacks is the ability to persuade without argument, right? And but the best poems I've always felt like sort of hide their argument. They hide the seams in their form. There's this mysterious bond between the audience and the poem's mechanics, sort of slipping in and out of the reader and inviting that person to read this over and over and over again. We all have a sound imprint within us, a sort of a blueprint, a voice that we want to inhabit. And I try to think of myself as a being of pure sound. I want to be, I'd like to make an orchestra of a single man and make everything possible. And I want to take everything I hear and return it as poetry. Emerson said, we listen so that we may speak. And I think Emerson is the most important voice in the 19th century. He said, art is the path of the creator to his work, and we hear so that we may speak. And see, poetry changes by touching other poetry. It's like magic in that way. Magic asserts that everything is connected. And as such, anything that is touched or moved touches everything along the grid, right? Poetry is the same way. When it's sort of like the blues tradition in that manner, because there's a constant borrowing that takes place where ideas and lyrics overlap, and they're passed down or shared from artist to artist and one generation to another in different contexts. A blues song really only has life as long as the musician is playing it, but it changes the player. And words are music. The poem and its sound have always walked together, or they walk sort of inside one another, because a poet has to sort of wear their music like a skin to constantly be aware of what they're creating. And the poem is the force that music exerts through the language. Sound brings us to our senses, Thoreau said. And Willie Dixon, who I think is the poet laureate of the blues, he said, I am the blues.
All right now. So that's really the crux of it. Really, is like, I love the way you talk about the idea of basically you embodying it. You know, you're not just speaking it or creating it. Try to embody it. So how can someone who maybe be struggling with that, who may, you know, the work may be, you know, more than adequate. They write beautiful words, and as they say, you know, the best words in their best order, but something they feel like is they want to get to a different level. They want to have more musicality, or more rhythm, just more impact, you know, with their, not only with on the page, because that's where it starts in your mind really, but beyond the page, but it's also when they deliver it. How can they kind of make that difference? You know, how they can make that step up?
Well, Mark Twain said the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and lightning bug, right? So one of the things is to try to figure out, now poetry is a long piece of hungry momentum, and it's flying headlong down the page, right? And we should admit no impediment to that flow with authority. And most of the time we find impediments in a poem, they're either psychological or they're technical. And I discover that most folks, they have a sense of the rhythm, but when I'm editing them, either for the review or folks, you know, pay me to edit their books, or I'm in workshops, I discover that most folks, they get bogged down with proximity, because sound loves proximity. But folks sometimes don't realize that you have to make, you want your verbs to be active, not passive. You don't, if there's a technical impediment to a sentence, most of the time that's easy to discover and eradicate. But if you have a psychological impediment, that's more difficult, because we have to learn that nothing we write is sacred. Nothing is sacred. Everything is due to be excised from the poem. Picasso said, art is the elimination of the unnecessary. And so condensation is the final frontier. Learning what to take away, right? And that's the hardest part of it. You know, the page is a cold bed. Poetry has to live in the air. And so one of the ways that I figure that out is I have a cassette player. For those of you tuning in that are younger than myself and some of the other folks will remember that a cassette player actually has little cassettes that you put in them, and you have to press a button that says play. And so I have one of those in the center of my table, and when I'm composing a poem, I treat it like a piece of sonic architecture. I go around the table over and over and over again, and I recite that poem into the cassette player, and I listen to it back. And I sing into it, and I listen to it back. Dylan Thomas used to take the poems that he admired, and he would write them down in longhand, every poem that he admired, so that he could constantly be thinking about the music and the structure of that language. And so by the act of writing it forced him to read it in a different manner. And get in the habit of having some sort of ceremony. One of the things I quoted Kafka earlier when I talked about art is the axe with which we break open the frozen sea within ourselves. He said that writing should also be a ceremony, and in that manner, he wrote a little piece where he talked about this tribe, and the tribe was trying to discover God. They felt like their God had abandoned them, and how could they rediscover God? And so they were trying to think of these things that they could sacrifice to the gods to have one of them visit. And so they put this saucer of milk in their little hut where they had an altar built where they could go worship. And that saucer of milk, of course, attracted jaguar out of the jungle. The cat came in, drank the milk up. And then when the tribesmen came back in and discovered that, slowly but surely, this became a part of their everyday routine. And over time, the jaguar, they began to think that was the god, because the jaguar was manifested in that moment where the connection between the sacrifice and the jaguar. And the jaguar suddenly its coat becomes part of the tapestry of the tribe, the way that they painted, the sounds that the jaguar made, the way the jaguar looked. And in that way, the jaguar became their god. they assimilated the ceremony of worship into their creative act. And as a consequence, the creative act became something that everybody could participate in. So poetry in that manner, I guess to say, Celestine, you've muted your mic. So poetry became in that manner for them, you know, it became the Jaguar and the idea of their sacred literature all became interspersed with one another. Everything that we do becomes part of our writing ceremony. When I lived in Nashville, when I first started my band, and I had a lot of these old songwriters that I used to hang out with. And Willie Nelson told me that he carried around a hook book, H-O-O-K. And he was constantly looking for hooks. I remember these friends of mine, Warren Haynes, another friend of his, they wrote this country song. We were playing poker one time and I saw one of them write it down. And it was one of a kind working on a full house. And that became this hook. So these guys are constantly looking for these hooks. I think poets should be the same way, constantly looking for things. Like Jonathan Williams is one of the greatest purveyors of found poetry that I've ever read. Jonathan was constantly, had a book around, and he was constantly writing down these found lines that he saw on signposts and you know, at traffic stops and bumper stickers and things like that, and they would make their way into to his poetry. You know, poetry is, you know, it's made from music, but it's really not the same thing, because poetry stops time and music depends on its movement. See, poetry and music are sort of mongrels. When they're fed together, they gather things to them, and there's things that stick. Everything is possible in a poem. And I think it's important for us to consider the possibility that we can write about anything. When you first asked me this question, you asked me how could people feel that some of their poetry is more important. One of the ways is to take on important issues. When Whitman, I think of Walt Whitman, I think of Emily Dickinson as our mother and our father. And when you think of Whitman, you have to think about a window. The entire world flowed into Whitman through that window, and he felt like he was a part of that entire world, right? Dickinson, on the other hand, you have to think of her as a mirror. She was constantly looking into that mirror, and the whole world was contained into the microcosm of her imagination. And then her poetry became the macrocosm that manifested out of that relationship with her own body and her own thoughts. Both are completely fruitful, and both are completely, strategies are relevant. But we find ourselves trying to figure out which rail we should go down the road on. And I think both are important, but in some ways, I think it's important to have that exchange with the whole world as best you can.
You know, this is one of the quotes I got from that someone talked about you in an article written in 2000. And it says, Rel, which is the person who talked about you, runs his finger along the seam between music and poetry. And he quotes, Flynn's poetic vision is a music immediate, large, and cosmologically local. Whenever it happens, however it happens to transpire. What is most praiseworthy in Flynn's work, according to Revel, is his stubborn refusal to succumb to the cancer that is killing contemporary poetry, the urge to abstraction. And so that kind of speaks when you talk about the everyday kinds of things, you know, things that the hook, the things that we can write about anything. So how does that really represent how you work? No, that's what their take on you in 2000, which was a little while ago. So are you still, you know, you think that still speaks to how you know, approach your poetry now?
Well, that's good advice for anybody, because you heard me talk about our mother and father. I'll take the family tree a little further. I think our great uncles in the 20th century are Wallace Stevens and Dr. William Carlos Williams. Williams said, no ideas, but in things. And one of the most important things about Williams and what he accomplished was, besides delivering a couple thousand babies, was the idea that the American vernacular, the American speech patterns, American slang were all things that could be put into the great slop bucket of American poetry. And he wanted to rescue sort of us from the forms, the old English forms, the villas, the sestinas, and the sonnet forms, and to create an American poetry that was unlike anything else. And so what he believed is you should peg your work to imagery that is vivid. You should enter a poem in action and leave it in motion. And so, in other words, the poem should already be taking place before you bring the reader's thought process into it, right? And you want to leave the poem with some sort of image that can set the reader's imagination in motion, so that when they leave the poem, they have a central image that they can attach the ideas to. I think abstraction most of the time doesn't work. I mean, when you're talking about abstract language, you're talking about love, hope, fear, honor, patriotism, the last refuge of scoundrels. And as a consequence, those things don't really attach themselves to people's everyday life. It doesn't have the same overweening influence. There's nothing tangible to attach it to. And poetry wants to be tangible. Poetry wants to stand for something. Poetry, and as a consequence, the best poems you can think of have that kind of have that kind of sort of metaphorical quality. I think of a Sylvia Plath poem where it's called Morning Song, and the very first line is, love set you going like a fat gold watch, right? And she's talking about a child, right? Let's read it. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your bald cry took its place among the elements. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. New statue. In a drafty museum, your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round blankly as walls. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. All night, your moth breath flickers among the flat pink roses. I wake to listen. A far sea moves in my ear. One cry, and I stumble from bed, cow heavy and floral in my Victorian nightgown. Your mouth opens clean as a cat's. The window square whitens and swallows its dull stars. And now you try your handful of notes. The clear vowels rise like balloons.
Wow. Thank you for that. Wow, that is awesome.
So that is an image-filled poem, dense with imagery, and it speaks to our own inner life. That poem was written by Sylvia Plath. It was called Morning Song. It's important, I think, that Plath has a lot to teach us about the metaphorical use of language as much as anybody else, particularly in the 60s. But there are other poets from that same era, that Theodore Roethke, John Berryman. Berryman's Dream Songs is one of the most important books that I encountered when I first started writing. Also, I think about Henry Miller's Colossus of Marusi is an amazing book that's full of imagery like that. Anne Sexton's Transformations, where she took all the grim fairy tales and turned them into these modern sort of contemporary fables. Rimbaud. I think about Borges. Borges used to say that poetry needs to have the right combination of algebra and fire. And that's part of what I'm talking about.
Well, I wanted you to start reading some of your poetry right now. I just want to point people to the chat. Make sure you save the chat. Paul Jones had posted a few links to when he's talking about, especially White Rock, the live at White Rock as well as Keith's found website. Joan has put some things in there, how to get up with the NC Poetry Contest. So everybody's putting things, and people making comments. One of the comments were that you were such, that Marilyn made was that what a great teacher you are, that I keep learning from you and loving every moment. And so there's a lot of great comments being made. I don't know what's being made on Facebook. I'm not looking at that right now, but want to give you a chance to read some of your work, and then please have your questions ready. You will have a chance to ask some questions, and just take it away. Because and talk about also, maybe you want to talk about this before you start reading. This is your photo essay book that you had with Charter Weeks called Prosperity Gospel, which is kind of a new kind of direction, I guess. And then you can just start your reading, at your will.
I do want to talk, say something about Prosperity Gospel. It's called Portraits of the Great Recession. And that book just came out in September. We interviewed about 200 people about how they were affected by the recession. And then Charter Weeks, who's a photographer, accompanied me. That book has done very well. It's sort of my love letter to the region in many ways. And also I'm writing a novel called The Red Tornadoes, which talks about, it's a basketball, poetry, murder, mystery, thriller. It's got a lot of hyphens in its elevator pitch. Let me read you something. I'm going to do this one for my good buddy, Garrett Hongo. I see Garrett is hanging out here. I'm glad to see you here, Garrett. He has a new book out called The Perfect Sound. And when you hear me talking about sonic architecture and, how that poetry and music are mongrels, and then when they're properly fed, they gather things to them, and then they're comprised of the things they gather. Garrett is made up of the sounds that he encountered in his life, and his book is called The Perfect Sound. It's an amazing book. I just started reading it yesterday. So I'm going to do this poem for G. This is I had a plane flight from Chicago to New York one time with a poet named Paul Motion, who's a drummer, used to play with the Bill Evans Trio. And I want to talk a little bit about how it's important that we learn how to get out of the way of the poems, that we have to eradicate the ego, that to be an open portal for language means that we shouldn't, the book of deliverance reads surrender. And the way to write books of deliverance means that we have to get out of the way of the language and not be so concerned about how it makes us appear as people, but the purity of the language of the poem is most important. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Let me read this poem though. This is a conversation I had on a plane with Paul Motion, a drummer. This is called Like a Buddha, Paul Motion says. When Paul Motion played drums, he seemed hardly there. A swish, a stir, and then with the whimsy of a ghost slowly rising from the vent, several frozen colors came splashing rapidly down, like flushed birds in the distance. It's the sound an exploding dandelion might make if it were made of tin, when all else stopped and silence strained at its bit, listening for him. I support the band, he asserted. I am an accompanist. I'm there to make it happen, not to linger. Like when I made Monk twirl, he says, stirring the air with his finger. What else is there? He shrugs, plays with his teeth. I know that a far greater country exists, he asserts. I have set my foot down on it. Many rhythms occurring all at once, layers of strings. His eyebrows sting and sharpen. Why ask? He is restful and folds his hands one inside another. There are perfectly good explanations for the simultaneous risks we juggle. There are shipyards of baubles and harbors that have dried up, and martinis made up by Episcopalians that burnish them for the plagiarisms of the Holy Spirit. It's only right that the room is furnished with importance and low light. You got to flaunt the groove, I say, with flourishes and gentle force, I guess, right? You got to play like a Buddha, Paul Motion says. Rhythm sort of forces everybody to join it, like birds that are kind of overwhelmed by the sound of beating wings, and they're compelled to take to the air. The first blues songs really were sung in the fields, and the lyrics formed a code that all the workers understood. Many of the slaves in the fields that were trying to stay out of the purview of their various masters and managers and stewards, and if there was a piece of news that the foreman didn't need to know about, they would have a smoke signal which was tuned into the wavelength of the tribe, and everybody would come and join in, and then they would sing to one another their way forward to where they were meeting and what they were meeting about. Rhythm, it's interesting because one of the things we can sit here and we can talk about all day long, how much rhythm matters and how poetry and music are a single rhythm, and I think they are. But the minute I start doing this, doesn't matter what's happening at your place, doesn't matter what's happening in any of your world, everybody comes straight to that rhythm, right? Because rhythm takes a room over. And that's what's most important about a poem, right? Is its rhythm, its impetus, the force that drives through that poem that connects to the reader it was intended for. Because there are poems all over. They're going up the mountainside, sliding through the forest, through the ash cans and down the alleyways and in the windows. And they're trying to find the readers that they were meant for. And so there's poetry for everybody. You just have to learn to listen.
That's awesome. Now that's awesome. Poems for everybody. You just have to listen. So I want to talk to, as you begin to read your book, talk about how you kind of, the sections that you have in and how was your thinking and how you put this book together.
Well, it's pretty simple. For somebody who talks about condensation so much, I write some fairly large poems on occasion. Now, those poems may start out being, 600 or 700 lines, and to get them down to 100 lines is surely putting them under some pressure. And words are like atoms, right? The more pressure you put them under, the more radioactive they become. And that's what condensation is. It's the ability for a poem to find its own radioactivity by the words that you choose, the right words in the right order, lending light. And the light is you finding that right order in such a manner that the poem, to take one piece of the poem away, changes it entirely. To change one piece of punctuation, changes it entirely. Sort of like playing Jenga, right? You pull that little thing out and suddenly the whole thing falls apart. I want my poems to be so tight, John Berryman said, that a mosquito can't squeak through, right? And so I think that's part of the importance of what I've discovered is the difference between most professional poets and poets who are more amateur are the ability to edit. Many times I can see that the poem is all there, but the poet hasn't learned yet enough to be able to let loose or to surrender the things that are obstructing the poem's flow, and which is part of it. And so I think that's all of those things come into play when you're trying to talk about how should a poem have an impact, right? I know I digress a little bit. What was it? What was the first thing you said?
No, you're hitting it right on the head. I just was, just talking about, how you put your book together, because it's like with especially this particular book, how you you have like 3 main sections.
Well, the Skin of Meaning has a Picasso on the cover, which makes me very happy. I love Picasso. I've learned a lot from him. He's the one that I said earlier, art is the elimination of all the unnecessary elements. And this book is the simple. I was starting out talking about I used to have a bigger poem that I pare away to make it smaller. I also have poems that are 6 or 8 lines long, but condensation is the final frontier for a writer. That's how they figure it out. This book has 3 sections, and each one is a single word title. I wrote it in a different manner than books previous, because when I have that big poem and I would sort of anchor it in the middle and write around it. Or I would write around like when I wrote Colony Collapse Disorder, I thought about was thinking about how colonial powers are going to be able to assimilate, let's say, the industrialization that hits third world countries, and we already have reached the limits of what the planet can stand in terms of what the major industrial nations have already done. How do we tell those smaller nations, oh, you don't get to have an industrial age for your country because we've already messed the planet up so bad that where do you fit in? And you think about India and China, who are still building coal-fired power plants at an alarming rate. So, we're going in the wrong direction. But colony collapse disorder was a malady that affected beehives, well, the world over. And so I began to think of the world as a beehive that had been disturbed by the upsets in its natural order. And so that's how the book came to be. This book has 3 titles. It starts out with etymologies, or the history of a word. The second is dichotomies, which is words in sort of the obverse of one another. How does one word can mean 2 different things, or how do 2 words rub their legs against one another that happen to have the same difference to them? And then the last section is necrologies, which is the history of a death, or the nihilism that a word can eventually, words are constantly being invented. Languages are coming up and languages are going extinct. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was how do our lives that also have these constant oppressions and these constant pressures, how does that affect the language we speak, and what does language even mean to us anymore? And so I wanted to start out talking about how the history of certain words and how they work their way forward. And actually, let me read a poem. See if I can find it. It's called the single word. It's called Ceremony. And normally I can go right to these things, but I'm not finding it. Oh, here it is. This is the word ceremony. And it also speaks to the death of a word and the beginning of a word at the same time. You can't stand on it or be dumped by it, unceremoniously or otherwise. It's the bid rigging that makes you want to find your own starlet, oozily boozy and wildly willing to succumb to the dealer in the middle of his 4th shoe. Though if you ever make a real run in Vegas or Hollywood, then all bets are off. Life won't lay the same way again, and the definitions of your previous scandals are formidably challenged and secretly downgraded, and they're changed in the light of fresh circumstances, just like language. Take terrorism, for example, which was once defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as government by intimidation. And now whole governments are intimidated by a handful of foreign terrorists with their mind on paradise and their fingertips sliding greasily over the uncertain construction of their underwear bomb. It takes a village idiot to kill them softly, with sordid reviews and bad word of mouth. The English invented football, what we roughnecks call soccer, when they kicked around the heads of Danish invaders they had slaughtered. And that's where the whole mess gets tricky, you see. One man's game is the other's life in full, with the power of luck attesting to the difference between a top and a bottom. In 10 minutes, a hurricane releases more energy than all the world's nuclear weapons detonated at once. That puts the eye on that particular apocalypse trigger in several places at the same time, and we were already running out of names for our hurricanes. There are more plastic flamingos than real ones in the United States, but all the swans in England are the property of the Queen. Just the mention of a public superstition, for instance, that the mad pacing ravens kept in the Tower of London would cause the monarchy to fail if they were ever to leave, causes a job for a British citizen. someone to clip the raven's wings, assuring that they stay put. Drones in a hive have only one job, to mate with their queen, and those lucky enough to do so die in the act. It is a tender fact that the heart of a full-grown blue whale is as large as a small Toyota, and its tongue is as long as an elephant, tail to trunk. But when the dealer in a casino spies a whale, the casino is alerted and his chances get the swell swatted right out of them. It ain't the love that gets you killed, it's the letter. It's not the spike that wins the point, it's the setter. The machinations of the tapping shoes accompanied by piano go tripping down the wrong dark alley just to help a friend. Or you hear the rhythm in the square, and for a second you stop to listen and you step off in front of the onrushing bus whose passengers are mortified and their eyes reveal your fresh future. And its brakes announce your entry and your end.
You want to take a few questions now and then read some more in a couple minutes, or
I'll do whatever, Celestine, do whatever you want.
I think people have some comments. You have anyone has any comments now?
Please do. I'm happy to take some.
Unmic yourself and ask questions or make any comments you have at this time.
Go ahead. Let's have them.
Okay, it's welcome. Just unmute yourself and speak.
So Keith, you said, I mean, I love the talk, thanks. And there's so many great lines you said, but of course, one that piqued my interest for you to say a little bit more about was when you said that a poem stops time. And yet you also talked about how the poem moves like music. So I just wanted you to say a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Well, I was comparing a poem to a piece of music. It's a musical composition. And a poem stops time in the sense that the minute you've read a poem that takes your head off, as Emily Dickinson used to say, you know, when it takes your head off, it stops you in your tracks. It makes everything else seem secondary to what's taking place in your life at that moment. And there's also typically something, I believe a human being in love with mystery is never finished. And so we're constantly trying to find mystery to add to our lives. And poetry is one of those mysteries. And poetry contains mysteries if it's written properly. And so it gets in your body and it stops you. A piece of music, if it stops, it has to quickly take up its momentum again, because a piece of music doesn't exist unless it's ongoing, unless the melody's taking place, unless the rhythm and the tempo and the groove are happening. So in that way, poem is powerful how it stops time, and music is powerful in that its timing has to be perfect and it has to be repetitive in many ways. Guys can talk about getting outside the one, but a piece of music or a pop song or something like that, it doesn't work the minute it stops. It's got to keep going. So that's part of what I meant about that. And also, like I said, Bill Matthews talked about a poem. You know, music can persuade without argument, and a poem doesn't necessarily have to have a point of view, but it has to have a point of reference. It's not that I have to explain to you what it is that I mean, but I have to reference what I mean in such a manner that it makes you understand it, right? Music never has to do that. Music moves you completely without any kind of relevant vantage point. It's sort of like, I think it was Gore Vidal said that a great director may make a bad movie, but a bad director will never make a great one, right? And so it's the nature of trying to figure out to get the music right. And once the music's right, then the poem doesn't belong to you anymore. You know, the primacy of the reader is something that I teach in all my workshops, that once a poem is accomplished, published, or written, then it belongs to the reader. And no matter of an influence or persuasion that you have is going to change how it affects the reader in its finished form, right? And people have different worldviews. If a giant pterodactyl flew over my little church here and pulled the roof off and flew with a witch's hat on up the valley. And there were 10 people in the room. Once the police showed up and started taking affidavits, every single person in the room would tell a different story about what happened, right? And a poem is the same way. I think it was McLeish that said a poem must not mean, but be. And in that manner, a poem is a little bee that gets into your brain and will not leave you alone.
I have a question too. You kind of brought to mind what you just said about how does that work with spoken word? 'Cause a lot of spoken word artists, they deliver really great, beautiful messages and do it in such a way that it really moves you. But not all of them write their stuff down. You know, they're just totally oral, performative, and you have to catch it at that moment. So you don't have that same way of kind of being able to, you know, the reader doesn't have the same kind of ability, the audience don't have the same kind of ability to kind of grab ownership of it in the same way you do if it's you know, written. So just how is
Well,
I guess I'm saying, you know, just whatever you want to reflect on that.
well, it goes back to the point of what I said a minute ago, that the page is a cold bed. Poetry has to live in the air. And so I believe that the best poems, of course, can do both. But the problem with a lot of times when people are performing, you know, poets, even great poets, there are very few poets that I have discovered who are really great in terms of the poetry they do create and a poem as it appears in the air. They have a difficult time appearing in front of people. When America, year after year after year, when we take polls and we talk about what Americans are afraid of, number one is always speaking in public, and death is number two, right? So that means that most people at a funeral had rather be delivering the elegy. They'd rather be in the box than deliver the elegy. In other words, if they're more afraid of speaking in public than dying, then they'd rather be in the box than deliver the elegy. I don't think that's true in its most its greatest manifestation, but I think that people are petrified of speaking and being judged. And a lot of people don't like their voice. They're afraid of their appearance. One of the things I try to do is, and I did this when I was younger more than I do it now. Garrett put a note up here. He said, I think most poets are narcissists. They love being on stage. They don't know when to shut up. That is true. I have discovered of both amateurs and professionals, but they are narcissists sometimes, but that doesn't mean they're delivering their poetry in a way that holds the audience. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that it's a matter of confidence in some ways, but learning to deliver it, part of it is authenticity. You know what I'm saying? You have to, I think it's important that what you say, like for instance, for tell a joke, comedy is not funny unless it's true, right? And we don't like singers unless we believe them. In other words, Tom Petty is not a great singer by any stretch of the imagination, but his authenticity comes through in every word that he sings. And a poem should be the same way. Your authenticity, if you don't feel it, then you can't allow the audience to feel it, right? Louis Armstrong said, I want, and you have to use the silence also, because Louis Armstrong said, I want the audience to be so silent that they can hear a rat in the walls pissing on cotton, right? And so you have to think of the poem also as pieces of big silence as well. There are moments in a poem where all that white space on the page, that's silence, right? That's not noise, that's silence. And you have to read the silence into the poem itself, right? Hemingway used to call it the white bull that I confront before he started in a blank page. And so allowing the silence is one way to create weight in the poem as well. Dramatic tension, surface tension. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so one of the things that I tell people that when you think it's going bad, if you're doing a reading and you think it's going poorly, the best thing you can do is stop. Stop. Get your bearings and begin again and slow down. Because most of the time, if people think their reading is going badly, they begin to speed things up. They want to get it over with. They want to read it as quickly as they can, yada, 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 and get off the stage, right? But the best thing to do is slow down, feel the gravitas of the moment, allow it to wash over you, and let the words have their say and forget about yourself. Get the individual out of the way, remove the ego, and listen to the poem, and the poem will speak. It's just speaking through you after that.
Keith, I wonder, this is a little a different angle here. I wonder if you say a little bit about how poetry saves lives. And I know with all this horror going on, I couldn't sleep until I wrote a poem. And not that it saved my life, but I think it's saving lives. I think it's saving lives in Ukraine and in Russia and different places. And I think it saved lives throughout history. I'm thinking you might have something to say about that.
Well, I'm of two minds about that, Judith. One is I do believe that, you know, I think it was Dr. Williams that said men die miserably every day for the lack of the news that poetry provides. And I think that Robert Frost talked about people that are not in touch with their creative selves are like trees in winter. Cambium is your creative juice, and it's flowing through that tree. And in winter, that tree is dead for all intents and purposes until the cambium comes back into its veins in the spring. And people are the same way. If they're not in touch with their creative selves, they're a husk in some ways. They're looking for something to add meaning to their lives, and poetry can do that. And also, it's no coincidence that when dictators take over, they kill the intellectuals and the poets first, because the poets are bringing the news that men need every day. The other thing about that is, I don't believe that poetry should stand in for therapy. I don't believe that poetry should stand in for psychiatry. I think it's very important that a poem is an art, piece of art. And if that art is performed and or constructed properly, then its resonance is greater than we are, is greater than the circumstances that surround us. Then in that manner, it becomes redemptive. You know what I'm saying? But and there are lots of folks that teach writing workshops, and they teach them as, you know, sort of psychiatric exercises, sort of like AA. Show up, write your poem, get the bad juju out, and you're going to feel better. But I don't personally believe in teaching that way, because I'm trying to create the best poetry that we can find, and I'm not a preacher. I'm not trying to save souls, if you know what I'm saying. If a soul is saved in the intrinsic nature of my work, and a poem means something to somebody, that's an entirely different lesson. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
That really was a great question, Judith. So we're going to try to round it up. I want to keep people longer than what they plan to be, but I want to know what kind of parting thoughts you can leave us with. You can leave us with another poem if you like to, but I want to make sure I get this out here. Is that I read a quote, and I don't know who was the author of it, but it was let's see. Let me make sure I get this. It was it says, it is impossible to reason about art. And so Keith, do you agree with this statement? And why is poetry, you touched on a lot, but why is poetry, particularly important to modern society? Like you said, it's not psychiatric care, but why is it important? And so and so we talk about poetry in terms of how it performs and how it should perform as far as how it's written in the craft of poetry. But think about it, how can it really play a part in just not, as periphery, as some people try to think poetry is just periphery to our lives, but how can people understand how important it can be if they allow it to be?
Well, this goes right back to what I was talking about earlier. Poetry is what the world wants when its heart is broken. Poetry is what we use. I mean, it's our highest form of expression. If you hear, we're getting ready to start March Madness, buzzer beater after buzzer beater after buzzer beater. We get all excited. We watch those. Even people who are not fans every day, like myself, who check the scores every day, and who grows up, loving the Lakers and from the time I was 8 years old, and I live and die with the purple and gold, right? But I think what happens is, poetry is everywhere. Poetry, like I said, if those announcers talk about what's happening in front of them, they see an athletic act, they go, "Oh my goodness, that's pure poetry," or "That's poetry in motion." And that's the highest form of praise that we can give anything, is to call it poetry. Because when poetry is right, nothing else is as powerful. Nothing in this planet is as powerful as language shared between peoples, right? And poetry, I often, one of the things I try to do with the Asheville Poetry Review is I publish translations in every issue. And we've published over almost 2,000 poets. In 28 years, we've published almost 2,000 poets from 21 different countries. And I think it's really important to introduce our readership to different points of view and different cultural touch points and language. Even though I do believe this also, I believe that reading a poem in translation is a little bit like kissing through a shower curtain. You get the thrust, but you miss the nuance, right? And so with reading a poem in translation, I remember the first Rilke poems that I ever read were translated by Robert Bly, and Bly probably didn't even speak German, right? But it was important to think about how that poem assimilated its way into my body. And it, when at the end, when he's talking about the statue of Apollo and he's looking up and Apollo looks down and says, "You must change your life." Those kinds of poems resonate throughout the language, no matter what language it is. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why poetry is our highest form of expression, because it's our first form of expression. It is the music that gets and ties our tongue around it and allows us to communicate. It allows us to say the things that we want to say. That's why poetry matters.
Thank you for that. Yes, poetry matters. Poets and poetry matters. So tell us, remind us how we can get your books and what's on your calendar for the next few months.
Well, the Skin of Meaning can be obtained through Red Hen Press. Red Hen Press brought it out, and the newest book, Portraits of the Great Prosperity Gospel, Portraits of the Great Recession, was brought out by Red Hawk Publications. I'm also, I wanted to have everybody go to Live at White Rock Hall, go to the dashboard and see radio sessions, and you can hear the first 6 radio shows. Also, you can see what we're doing here with the Live at White Rock Hall shows here in this sanctuary itself. I'm working on a new novel called The Red Tornadoes. I've been authorized by the family of Rip Torn to write his biography. The actor Rip Torn. I have a new book finished called which is called The History of Rock and Roll. After that, I have selected poems coming out, and I have a book of essays on boxing called 12 Bells, Essays on the Hurt Game. And last but not least, I have another novel that I've also just started outlining called The Rope Walker, which is about a one-legged Mayan circus performer set during the Mexican Revolution.
So So you're going to be a little bit
Yeah.
busy. Is that
I,
right?
I just set up the next decade of my life for you.
Exactly. It sounds like it.
Uh,
Sounds
So,
like it.
yeah, see, careful what you ask me. I might go on too long.
Okay, so I want to thank you so much for joining us, and it's just been, I always love to hear from you because I always, always got, you leave so many great nuggets for us to absorb and apply to what we're doing and things for us to carry forth. I'm always, so I hope you come back and visit, North Carolina Porch Society in some form, and also I'm thankful to you about your publication that you have a way of really helping other because I know as a publisher you can help, a lot of poets probably improve what they're writing because you're not going to let it sit out there any old kind of way. So I know that whole process is also very helpful to many poets who might be written great works, but I know they're even greater after passing through your what you've set up there for them. So do you have any last words that you want to leave us with before we sign off?
Actually, I wrote something down this morning.
Okay.
I wrote, it's not a new poem, but it's something that I thought would be relevant to our conversation.
Okay.
And then I want to speak about it just a second. And then I want to talk about what it's like being the editor of a journal
Okay.
and how to think about your work being published. And then we can end with that. Is that okay?
That'll be wonderful.
This morning, I was thinking about when people write how to overcome their fear, because fear is it's a way to freeze us in our place and keep us from becoming more than we are. We are afraid to act. And I wrote this down. Fear is a choice that occurs when we are not in the moment, when we are fixated on the past or trying to predict the future, because the past and future don't exist. The only thing that exists when inspiration is present is right now. Regret is also a toxic human construct, corrosive to any ambitious creative endeavor. Like guilt, regret is paralyzing and stops all forward motion. It is scar tissue that freezes the redemptive force of the human imagination inside its previous failures. And all writers fail. A lot. Learning to get used to failure is part of the ceremony of being a writer, right? But failure is our friend. It teaches us and constructs, sentence by sentence, how to live inside the voice that is ours and ours alone, which is the guilt-free portal through which we allow a total surrender to the deliverance of our most original ideas, our strategies, the channel that fills with authenticity so it fills our lungs so we can rise and sing. Chance favors the prepared mind. The more you practice, the luckier you get. And if you want to be struck by lightning, you got to cover your golf cart with antennas and drive into the storm, right? It's not wrong to seek perfection, but perfection doesn't exist. And as long as we claim to be seeking perfection, we don't have to finish anything or publish anything, because perfect is the armor that we wear to prevent ourselves from being seen, right? Perfection.
That wounded me, Keith. That wounded me right there.
Well, life doesn't come with a warning label, Celestine. You got to participate in your own rescue, right? And I want to read one more thing. This is just want to talk about editing, and then I'll be finished for the day. Okay, this is a little paragraph, and this is from this is a book that many of you folks may already have. It's called The Rhythm Method, Razzmatazz and Memory, How to Make Your Poetry Swing. Yeah, this book has been taught by a lot of writing programs and writing groups, and I think that it's been brought out again by Press 53. It was published in 2007, and I've lost track of the scores and scores of writing programs that have used it that I'm very grateful and happy about. But I want to say this about editing, and to think about when you submit your work, and then I'll hush up and get off you and let everybody go on about themselves. This is called I want you to think about all editing is subjective. Okay. And I don't ever send out rejection letters. I send out reaction letters. I don't, I can only react to what I'm given, right? I can't, I'm not rejecting the work. I'm only reacting to what I see it as I see it. And that's why all editing is subjective. And when we place ourselves in the hands of an editor, no amount of background, biography, or backslapping is going to help them decide to publish or reject a poem. There's only the poem in front of them, and it is as naked or sophisticated as the day it was born. The decision an editor makes in those moments is as arbitrary as possible, and yet contains a million other factors, dependent upon his or her mood, the weather, the amount of work, the themes of the issue, conscious and unconscious stylistic bias, their last meal's agreeable digestion, the time it took to read the mountain of poems in the first place, their children's piano lesson, the lack of a title, the length of the title, the stupidity of the damn title, the worth of the first line, the color of the paper stock, the unmitigated gall to send a multi-page biography, the fact that it's another damn sonnet, the fact that it's the perfect damn sonnet, the lack of a shower, bravado, pitch, vocabulary, humility, sweep, vision, humor, shape, rhetoric, form, diction. The action of the editor is riveted with love. Winston Churchill said, we make a living by what we get, we make a life by what we give. And the best poems stop us in our tracks, shut us up, make us read the poem again and again, because it has suddenly opened another room in our brain that was hidden to us before. I have been submitting my own poetry to other editors for their appraisal since I was 18 years old. And I know from firsthand experience the pain of that reaction letter, right? So I treat prospective contributors the way that I would want to be treated myself. And I hope my process bears the quality of tenderness.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think we all can appreciate that indeed. Because most people are not brave enough to go and say that, because they stand in though they're the absolutely authority on whether or not your poem is any good or not. And they may be, but you know, like I said, there's so many other things that contribute to how they react to it at any given moment. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being so generous with what you shared with us. And there's nothing that we could do to deserve such. We really do appreciate it. I know I do, and I'm sure everyone else does. And the audience, they're going to be watching it later on the Facebook, is going to do so also. So this has been Poets and Poetry Matters, a program for North Carolina Poetry Society in celebration of our 90th anniversary. Yay! So you guys come and check us out. Come and check out some of our program. You're all welcome. Most of our programs are open and free. So let's check us out. And thank you so much, Mr. Keith Flynn. And keep on doing what you're doing, brother. Appreciate you.
Celestine, I appreciate you and love you. It's very nice to see you again. And if there's anything in this world I can do for you, you let me know.
Well, you may hear from me soon.
Well,
All right.
I love the North Carolina Poetry Society. I've spoken at the, what's the name of the house down there?
Weymouth House.
Weymouth. I've spoken there probably over the last 30 years, probably 4 or 5 or 6 times. And I love being in Weymouth. I've spent the night there before, and that's a very, very special place. And the North Carolina Hall of Fame is also located there, the Literary Hall of Fame, if I'm not recalling.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so anybody gets a chance, it's in Laurinburg, is that correct?
I don't know why I'm gonna say the wrong. No, it's not in Laurinburg. It's in, oh my goodness, why did I just, so we haven't been there in about a couple of years now. Thank you.
Southern Pines.
Southern Pines. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
And there's a ghost.
Oh yeah, there's a ghost. Tell them about the ghost, Joan, real quick.
Well, I had a week-long residency there, and I had heard about the ghost who lives in the attic. And I don't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I stayed there for a week. And every night, as soon as I turned off the lights, lying in bed in the dark, I would hear footsteps. Maybe they were footsteps, but I knew that this was not an unfriendly sound or presence. This was not a malignant presence. It was all right that I was sharing the house with whatever was up there. So it is true. There's a ghost in Weymouth.
Okay.
Well,
So you guys have all that to look forward to, and then hopefully we're going to be back in Weymouth in September. So come on through, come on through. So again, our next meeting is going to be online. It's going to be a week from now on the Saturday, start at 10 a.m. So make sure you look out for that. Again, thank you so much, Keith. I don't know where you are now, but
I'm right here.
okay, there you are. Okay, thank you so much. Now, everyone have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.